think that's a great starting question. So human exceptionalism, your question is about the origins of it, and I think probably a lot of people and have read about all the very many possible origins, right? That we could talk about agriculture, we could talk about religion, we could talk about capitalism as it's unfolded. We can look at all the things that are included in that exceptionalism, all the different isms. But I find what is really interesting is to think about what is creating human exceptionalism now. So there's lots of things that brought it about, but how is it staying with us now when we know it's actually highly destructive to think this way? And so that's one of the reasons that I focus on language, on discourse, what I would call discourse, and when I talk about discourse, I'm talking about the symbolic ways that we create our worlds, but also the material ways we create our worlds, because they're intertwined, they're never separate. So and when it comes to human exceptionalism, we could look at every scale. We could look at our internal conversations. We could look at our interpersonal, organizational, institutional, our governmental. But at every scale, the dominant discourse is human exceptionalism. Whether we agree with that exceptionalism is real or not, it doesn't matter. It's something that we're reproducing constantly among ourselves. In terms of what effect, I think I want to back up just for a second. We could all probably think back to textbooks or even popular books right now, and often they will open up, and I think this is just starting to change with humans are the only species that. Humans are the only species who use tools. That's been disproved, obviously. Humans are the only species that have cultures, obviously not accurate. The only species who have language or communicate with each other in complex ways also. It's many of us know this isn't accurate, but it's a message we get over and over again. And more, since we seem to need a certain kind of experimental scientific truth to prove things, we're getting that disproved. So in terms of effects, I guess exceptionalism is hand in hand with the notion that we're separate from the rest of the living world and non-living world, right? So there's a separation, and with that separation, it's not just like we're on even ground, here's the rest of the world and here's us, but there's also, right, a hierarchy. And so within that hierarchy is where one of the things that we experience is human exceptionalism. And it's destroying us. It creates, we're living in a fallacy where we believe that dominantly that we are somehow different from, better than, master of the more than human world. And in that dynamic, that false dynamic, right, we can see what comes out of that, right? When we think we're separate from climate, when we think we're separate from the waters, when we think we're separate from the lands, we no longer care for those places. We no longer care for those, what are actually extensions of ourselves. And actually, it's beyond not caring. It's extracting and destroying and wasting. When we're talking about origin versus right now, right? Culture is dynamic, it's always changing, right? But there's these forces of keeping it as it is versus change, right? These kind of dialectics that are at play. And so one of the things I've been looking at over a couple decades of research in certain places is messages I heard over and over and over again of people, even those people who had literally taken their lives out from what was known and put them somewhere else just to protect a species or protect a place. And those folks who were all in, they were all into environmental protection or species protection, all of it, still would ridicule themselves, would censor themselves, silence themselves, label themselves when they said things that showed profound connection with the more than human world, that showed emotional connection, that showed a deep care. And it was in these spaces that I really started to notice wow, something's really going on here in terms of keeping anthropocentric identities in place. And this there's in my research observations, it's done to others, but also we do it to ourselves. So for instance, just yesterday I was with one of my research assistants, and we were, as we do in Sydney, we were having a research assistant a meeting on the beach, and someone was walking a dog by, and the dog was lunging, trying to get off the leash, trying to go smell something, trying to follow its own, agency and interest. And she said, "Oh God, I know this is going to sound really hippie of me, but it really bothers me when I see these, dogs on the leash and them tugged back." And she knows what I do. She's studying the same thing. She's writing about it. She's dedicated her life to it, and she still had to preface that care for a different species with, "I know this is going to sound kind of hippie." And so that labeling that we do, that there's plenty of censoring and silencing as well, and the ridicule of expressions of connection is one way that we discipline ourselves in dominant cultures to remain anthropocentric, to remain separate and master, and to and so I'm looking at this at a very interpersonal level, because we can certainly look at the structural reasons we are where we are right now, but until we change our basic paradigms, until we see our paradigms as paradigms, no change is going to happen at all. And so that's what I'm especially interested in. So, I mean, in systems theory, right, there's where do you get the most leverage? It's the most leverage is in seeing the paradigms we're living within as paradigms and not as just truths or the way it is. And then the next place you get the most leverage is by starting to deconstruct those paradigms, by starting to think about, well, what are the other paradigms we want to live by? And moving forward in that way. So one of the things that I've been working around is the whole notion of an eco-cultural identity. So there's been a lot of work on ecological identities from different spaces, including deep ecology. What I'm doing with the notion of eco-cultural identity is that all of our cultural identities are also ecological, whether extremely ecologically destructive or restorative, regenerative. And so to acknowledge that every single identity that we've taken on or that we engage with has an ecological dimension. Maybe you live in a city and you never, you shop at all the big shopping chains, and you only eat prepackaged food, and you don't have any access to green spaces. Maybe you live in a food desert. All of these, we could go on and on with examples, but you can start to see the eco part of the cultural that's in there. I'm working with a graduate student right now who's looking at climate adaptation discourses from the government. And one of the things that we've noticed is that the government never, and he may be on here right now, I don't know. Feel free to chime in, Harry, if you are. The government in Australia, and I believe this is probably true in other spaces, in many other spaces, many other countries, doesn't seem so far in the data he's looking at to refer to urban people when they talk about local communities, cultural spaces where change can happen, where resilience should happen, et cetera. And so that's 90, I don't remember where we are, 97% or something of the population of the country. So when we think of ecocultural identity, and the majority of us are urban now, what does it mean to be an urban individual? And what does that mean in terms of understanding our lives as ecologically embedded, even when we're seeing mostly concrete? Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this for a very long time. Mark Beckhoff has an encyclopedia series that I contributed, the entry on animals and language. And it would be good for me to have reviewed that before this talk because it was a while back, but it's definitely still part of what I'm interested in now. It's right now on the east and west coast of Australia, the humpbacks are migrating. And it's really interesting when we start to think about how we communicate about other animals. And I think that's the first move, is to say other animals, because it recognizes our animal selves, which starts to undo disconnection and this exceptionalism that we think somehow we're not an animal. And so it brings us back in connection. But humpbacks, as many of you know, are one of the biggest success stories of recent conservation efforts. And in Australia, they were at about 1,000 when whaling was made illegal. They're now, we think, at about 100,000, about 50,000 migrating up each coast, up and down each coast. And more of them, there's collisions happening, some funny, not funny, some not funny at all. And so there's interesting communication just about these whales, and what does it mean to share these waters that have been so depleted of life, and now that life in massive form is coming back. How do we talk about this in the media? Animals in Media is a great site actually to share. Carrie Packwood-Freeman's site, which is actually a style guide for people making media. In terms of how they communicate about animals. That's a really wonderful free tool out there. Anyway, right now I've had conversation in the past week where people, everyone's talking about whales here right now, and it's a beautiful thing. There was a whale that, and this is, you're gonna see me stumble over words sometimes, because as we try to rethink language so that it communicates what we feel instead of reproducing common sense, it's sometimes awkward, like speaking a new language. So I'm going to try to speak out the agency of this whale who was in Sydney Harbor last week or a couple weeks ago, and this fishing net that was in this young whale's way. So usually we talk about an entanglement, which is kind of about the whale's fault of this fishing gear being kind of, the whale got tangled up. But in fact, it was humans who carelessly left these fishing nets out there in the ocean as if it's not a living space. And there was this beautiful moment where there was live video coverage of almost a 24-hour attempt at rescuing this whale, helping this whale disentangle this whale, and building trust between the rescuers and the whale in Sydney Harbor, so in the biggest population center of the country. And so much attention, so much focus. I happened to tune into it about 20 minutes before the rescue was successful, and it was an amazing experience. I think I was with many people who were tuning in and communicating with that whale in the different ways that we do. Even as I say that, I can feel internally communicating with it, well, saying that I'm trying not to discipline myself to say, well, we don't communicate with other species, or how could we do that without actually being right there anyway? But there was this moment where all this attention and energy was focused on this young whale. I personally was communicating, you're safe, you could slow down. Everyone there is here to help you right now. And then the whale was free and very happy, I'm sure. These humpback sounds, today I spoke to someone who jumped back in the ocean today just to hear the songs of the humpbacks coming by. People are hearing it while they golf. So there's a re-entry of humpbacks specifically into our lives that I think is there. They have tremendous agency in shifting the way we're talking about the ocean. And there's other things that we can talk about. I'll just drop a couple things. Like if we think about, if we are calling animals it instead of who they are, and talking about them as who instead of that, there are really simple shifts that we can make in acknowledging the personhood and the in-spiritedness of other animals. moving away from terms like livestock and game and the many different terms that we use, even mass nouns like cattle, where we kind of, the individuality, the relationality of other animals disappears. And so just there's a mindfulness that, I mean, I'm assuming that almost probably everyone who's tuned in tonight, they are focused on change, and they are focused on and they're mindful and they are conscious. And so I think the next step for all of us, and many of you are probably already practicing this, is how do we communicate this different cultural orientation, which is a very ancient and enduring cultural orientation as well. How do we do this together? And the wonderful thing about it is it could happen almost instantly. Well, so something I talk about in Nature Freaks, in that talk, which is based on a chapter which I think because of copyright we can't share, but hopefully some people have the Handbook of Ecocultural Identity in their libraries, and if you don't, just feel free to email me and I can share this chapter individually. So I talk about kind of 4 ways of shifting ecocultural identity from anthropocentric to ecocentric that this is based on research of what I've seen people do successfully. And it's these 4 things, often in tandem, sometimes just one. The first thing is just flip the script. So this seems basic, but it's just refuse to be disciplined. So notice that you're being disciplined or self-disciplining and just refuse it. Don't play that game. I notice it as a game, and it's a very dangerous, self-destructive in terms of planetary self-destructive game. Another one is to do with others. So do with collectives. You may already have some collectives you do this with. You may form those collectives. There are all sorts of ways of doing with others, and of course, it's also way more fun to do these things with others. But go out on an urban foraging tour in your city, and meet other people and experience what it's like to notice the plants around you, and to leave plant blindness behind and understand that food grows in the ground around us. Another one is to be open, and this kind of overlaps with what I just said, which is to be open to many forms of knowledge. And that involves indigenous knowledges, it involves other species knowledges, it involves the knowledges of children. It involves opening our scope to those many knowledges. And the 4th one is being vulnerable. So being vulnerable means not being afraid to look ridiculous. It means showing that you care. It means stopping, in the middle of a walk with someone to listen, to tune in, to attune to where you are, and to bring them with you. But there's also many kinds of vulnerability, that just being aware that we are vulnerable, being aware that we are permeable, being aware that we are not. These kind of walking, unaffected containers moving around somehow without having ecosystems within ourselves that also move beyond us and are part of the ecosystems that we're more widely part of. It's a heightened awareness, and I think it's conversations like these that we can have with one another, where we start to see what we're saying, like killing 2 birds with 1 stone, and just shifting it. And the moment we shift it, something that isn't directly related to ecological, but I think in some ways is I've shifted deadline to birthline, because deadline is all about it's done, it's over. And in fact, often what we're creating is we've gestated, we've conceived, we've gestated, we're putting something out into the world that we care about at that moment, at that line. So there's just an attunement that we've lost, and David Abram talks about this and many others, about kind of losing that attunement with the abstraction of our language from what is directly where it came from, right? And what has animated it for thousands and thousands of years of having language. I mean, my work is all about this question. And so you could look at my work, but also there's the International Environmental Communication Association. There's the Environmental Communication Journal. There are many, many books. I would recommend looking at the Handbook of Ecocultural Identity, because we're looking from, I think about 15 different disciplines at language and how we form our positionalities. Something that I think Philippa will mention, but for those of you who are in Australia or anywhere in the world, there's a conference on communication and the environment. It's every 2 years. It's a beautiful conference. I happen to be the conference chair for the next one, which will be in 2025, and will take place in Tasmania here in Australia. So it's the first time the conference on communication and environment will be in the Southern Hemisphere. And it's open to academics, practitioners, activists, and artists as to present. It's open to everybody to attend. And it's going to be a very unconventional, very creative and co-creative conference. So I invite people to come there. It's going to be online as well. Actually, I don't know if you shared the Daily Delight Disrupt link, but this might be a good time to do it. So one of the things that has come out of my research is I'm trying with colleagues to start a global movement called Daily Delight Disrupt, which is about reconnecting. So being able to be responsible, being able to literally able to respond to the more than human world and to one another. And so we've tried to make it the least political movement that's ever existed on the planet. We try to take out any terms that will scare away anyone, and really get down to the essence of what is needed, which is reconnection. And to do so in a way that people feel they have a way in, that they're invited in to be co-creators of change, and that they feel empowered to co-create change. And so if you end up visiting this, you can also share the Instagram site. That might be a little bit more user-friendly than the university website, as they tend to be. So we've broken it down into days that are themed, and we have a multitude of ideas for, you can think of them as culture jams or eco-culture jams, that go from the very micro, just like having a playful moment in your day, especially for busy people, maybe walking, from home to work, a new direction, just getting out of the routine, and that opens you up to seeing a new tree, meeting a new dog, seeing a lizard that you never saw before. So Minimalism Monday, Tree Hugging Tuesday, Wayfinding Wednesday, Thankful Thursday, Feast Friday, Seek Your Own Adventure Saturday, and Screen Free Sunday. And the idea is that it gives people a space to be part of a global shift, a global paradigm shift, and to do so in bite-sized pieces, because this all can be very overwhelming, right? And so to do it and know that we're doing it with others is the approach. And so this has gotten a lot of interest from everything from mental health organizations to childhood education to news media platforms. So I believe I hope it's doing what we hoped it will do. And it's really near the beginning of creating one of many, many channels, one that is very open and that could be collaborative, and that is really infinite in terms of what people are able to do with it, not prescribed at all.